So hello and welcome to another episode of the Sentient Media Podcast, where we're meeting the people who are changing the way we think about and interact with our world and animals. Today we are meeting Cheryl Leahy, Executive Director of Animal Outlook. So hi Cheryl, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
So a little bit of background on Cheryl. She joined Animal Outlook in 2006 as General Counsel and the lead of the Legal Advocacy Program, and became Executive Director last year in 2020. Obviously, since 2006, and presumably before that, there have been a lot of wins, but there are a couple of standout moments that I'd like to highlight before we get into it. So there was one class action lawsuit against the dairy industry for price fixing, which resulted in a $52 million settlement. And then there was an investigation of Tyson Foods that resulted in an evidence driving the first ever charges and convictions for broiler breeding cruelty, which is just incredible. On top of that, she's also developed and taught one of the US's first courses on animals in agriculture and the law at UCLA. So Cheryl, thank you so much for joining us. We are massive fans of you and your work here at Sentient Media. And today you're going to talk to us firstly about a breaking investigation. Please fill us in on what you've been working on.
Yeah, so hot off the presses, we've just released our latest investigation, which is a broiler industry hatchery investigation. So for those who aren't familiar with the way the chicken industries are structured, the broiler industry is a type of chicken that people eat. So these are animals that are hatched at a hatchery, then they grow out for about 6 weeks, and then they are sent to slaughter. So this investigation is of the hatchery stage, and it's of a company called Case Farms, which is one of the top 15 US broiler production companies. And the investigation took place in North Carolina, which is a major ag state. And this is the really, I think, a really great kind of window into what does it look like day to day for the broiler industry at this hatchery level. I think it's both kind of, unfortunately, business as usual and particularly cruel. We're making an argument that, we believe this rises to the level of criminal animal cruelty. But it's so kind of entrenched in the day-to-day operations of this facility that, it's a really interesting sort of window into these animals really are just treated as objects. They're just sort of seen as widgets to part of the system. They process about 200,000 animals every day. So, over time, of course, they're kind of responsible for millions of animals over short periods of time. And we see things like animals being mangled on machinery, killed, left suffering until somebody happens to, pick them up and put them into this euthanizing machine, although I don't love the word euthanasia in this context, but basically a machine called a macerator, which I kind of think of as almost like a blender, like it's like a grinding up machine. And in this case, for what are considered cull birds that are either deformed or they're injured or they're too sick, they're essentially not commercially viable animals. They are, in this case, either put into a gassing machine first, where they're gassed with what we believe to be carbon dioxide, or they're just put fully conscious directly into this macerator. So we've got, basically fully conscious birds being dumped alive, birds going to these gassing machines, or if they're injured, maimed, kind of mutilated, just being kind of left out to suffer until someone happens to notice and pick them up. We've also got birds being dragged across trays in the sorting or the kind of, there's a processing line where they get sorted out of the trays, and then they go into these sort of conveyor belt systems, and that ends up, damaging, injuring, killing a number of animals. So this is pretty much, I think, a pretty good, cruel yet standard example of how the broiler industry works. And I think what we're really asking for is this company to be held accountable for the, the millions of animals that it's responsible for the very. So I hope that people will check this out on animaloutlook.org. You can watch the video there.
So, and you're saying that this is illegal like this is illegal behavior, this isn't accepted even on their own, regardless of sentience or, like, an ethical vegan's feeling about the animals, this is something that's actually illegal on their own terms.
Yeah, I think being, rising to the level of violating the duty of care, right? There's a certain amount of neglect, there's a certain amount of active cruelty. We do have throwing and rough handling, and that kind of goes into the more traditional buckets of animal cruelty. But under North Carolina law, you have a duty of care to these animals. Just any state's law, you have a duty of care. And if, the focus is on just getting as many through the system as fast as possible, that's not enough. That's not, rising to the level of basic care. And it crosses the line into criminal animal cruelty is the argument they're making.
So you've been at Animal Outlook for about 15 years. So I was wondering if you could introduce us a little bit to your mission there, and what your role is exactly, or has been.
Yeah, so we are a farm animal advocacy organization. Our mission is to challenge the status quo of animal agribusiness, and then we break it down into the different ways that we're doing that. So we have 4 programs. Our undercover investigations, which I just talked about. This is something we've done dozens of investigations over the years of everything from, say the hatchery level all the way to the slaughterhouse, large and small, kind of all over the place in terms of the animal, kind of really getting a picture, getting sort of a library of material around what is happening on factory farms and slaughterhouses, what animal agriculture looks like. And that, I think, heavily impacts the ability for us to do the other types of work that we do and for the movement to do other types of work. I really see investigations as kind of the engine that's driving a lot of the animal advocacy that we're able to do. And I really stand by that. I think that's why I'm still here after all of this. From day one, when I walked into the door, it really became clear to me how powerful this sort of raw material is and how much potential it has to leverage change. The other 3 programs, so the second one is legal advocacy. So that is mostly for us impact litigation. We do a fair amount of lawsuits around standard systemic cruelty, addressing the worst cruelty to the largest numbers of animals. Sometimes this is as a result of an investigation. Sometimes it's directly related to the animal cruelty. Sometimes it's seeking enforcement of animal cruelty laws, which is what we're doing, for example, in the case farms investigation. Sometimes it is using laws that were never originally intended to help animals, but where the harm to the human can be almost a stand-in for the harm to the animals. And we can kind of apply concepts that were not originally intended for animal cruelty or other similar harms, but we can apply them to some of the systemic harms of animal agribusiness. The third area of our programming is on what I would call sort of supply side work. So this is corporate engagement. We have a long history of working with, well, very early on it was restaurants, and then it moved into large food companies. So our most recent victory was around Starbucks, getting Starbucks to offer a nationwide vegan option, a vegan meal. Of course, they have all their plant milks and everything, and there's been a lot of positive evolution in that direction. So the idea there is to get these companies to replace their animal product items with vegan items. And sometimes we also work to get them to end some of the worst standard practices from an animal welfare point of view. We're also on the supply side doing work on the farming side of things. So trying to transition farms from animal farms to plant farms. And that's something that we're really growing. We just posted a position announcement to hire a director of farm transformations. And that, that idea of, okay, well, let's go to where the people are actually sort of controlling the largest numbers of animals or have the potential to make such an impact if they were to change their practices. I think that can be very high impact work. And then the fourth item is what we call outreach. It's basically vegan education, sort of moving veganism into the mainstream, and not just vegan eating, but vegan values, having kind of raising cultural literacy around why should people think about these issues? What do people need to know about these issues? And then also how practically can we help people along to move these concepts and these norms and behaviors into the mainstream.
Nice. Incredible work. And you've just exactly explained why we're such fans of everything that you do. The intersections and the thoughtfulness of that strategy is really powerful. I'm curious about your personal experience, like your personal journey into advocacy. Like, how did that start?
Well, I've always been an animal person. I was one of those kids, you know, who just really loved animals and had a natural connection to them. And I honestly think many of us are. I think a lot of people, you know, it's sort of going along with this theme of animals in society. There's sort of a natural element of human psychology that's very connected to animals. I really didn't have an opportunity to kind of apply that to my work or thinking about what I wanted to do until college, where I did environmental studies. And it was clear to me that you could have the intersection between environmental studies and animal protection, you know, clearly around factory farming or industrial animal ag work. It really struck me that you have an independent, compelling argument against factory farming from, you know, sort of almost parallel tracks, right? The environmental protection argument against factory farming is extremely strong. You don't have to touch any sort of animal rights, animal protection, any of that in order to kind of get yourself there. And then likewise, the argument for animal protection on the animal protection side or the animal rights side against basically animal ag wholesale is incredibly strong as well. And I thought that there was something so compelling about that. I thought there was so much potential for that. And then of course, later I learned about the additional arguments, which I think you could make the same point about human health, right? Being able to argue against animal ag from the point of view of human health. And then really to round it out, the human rights and sort of worker treatment and, you know, the implications for things like water scarcity and which communities and which, you know, populations are going to be subject to some of the worst pollution and the worst, you know, other kinds of issues. So really, I don't think, and I've said this in my classes before, and I ask people to, you know, sort of challenge what I'm saying, but nobody's taken me up on the offer to challenge this. But what I say is I really think factory farming is the biggest social justice issue facing humankind, right? It's just something that touches everything. And there's really no way for us to kind of move forward with all of our values as a society without addressing this and reversing course on this. We really took a wrong turn somewhere, you know, and built this system that we just can't sustain, and we shouldn't want to sustain it. So I went to law school kind of with that kind of thinking in mind, thinking that law is uniquely capable of kind of crystallizing moral progress in, you know, in our society. And I'm not sure, I think I still believe that. I think that there's still potential for the law to really move things forward. But I do think, you know, there's sort of a double-edged sword for me to look at the way that people really do care about animals. I mean, you look at things like survey data, people really do care about animals. And then the law seems to be kind of hanging back in a lot of ways. But in a lot of ways, the law is making progress and really, you know, crystallizing and capturing and sort of cementing that progress for animals. So I think it's a push and pull. I think it plays a really important role.
And I'm always so impressed by those individuals who take it upon themselves to be like, right, we are optimistic. We believe that the law can change, and that that's the way to find, you know, that's the way to changing the way that things are operating right now, whether it's for human rights or animal rights, or, yeah, as you say, these things, the environment, humans, you know, non-human animals, it's all completely connected. I'm curious, like, how you've, like, could you give us the broad strokes on animal law when it comes particularly to farmed animals? Like, do they have rights? You know, what are they entitled to? You mentioned at the beginning, you know, of the call about this investigation, and how animals do have a right to, you know, a duty of care. And obviously, you know, it changes state on state in the US. But I'm curious about, like, you know, is there any kind of basic thing that all farmed animals have rights to that exists?
Yeah, it's a really interesting way that you're presenting that question. The question of rights is something that I think, I mean, a lot of ink has been spilled on this in the legal side of things, but I think most people would think of rights in the most basic sense as sort of an acknowledgement of, the existence of interest, right? Somebody is there and the law is seeing that somebody, right? And so interesting because there's so many non-human examples of things that in that definition of rights have rights in our US system, at least. On the other hand, animals are farmed animals in particular, in practice, tend to be fairly ignored by our laws. So I'll lay this out for you a little bit. So, speaking about US law only, at the federal level, there is nothing that applies to the way the animal is treated from the time they are born or hatched until the time they are sent off to slaughter. So no federal law has applicability there. There are federal laws that are relevant in some way to farmed animals. And by that, I'm specifically talking about animals used for these commercial purposes, right? The meat, milk, and egg industries. The two laws are the 28-hour law, is number one, which is a transport law. So that says if you are transporting livestock, so it does not apply to birds, so we're talking numerically about a relatively small number of animals, for more than 28 continuous hours in a vehicle by common carrier, you have to give them food, water, and rest for 5 hours. Now, the history of this law is really interesting. It was last amended, I believe, in something like 1906. It was heavily enforced in the early half, especially 1920s, 1930s of the 20th century. And if you look at some of the legislative history of the law, you see a lot of real, putting a real flag in the ground for animals, including farmed animals. And that sort of tracks somewhat with the history of the animal protection movement. If you go back that far, that there really wasn't this special treatment for dogs and cats where everybody else was sort of left aside. This was part of, these animals were in the middle of cities. We had the Chicago stockyards and other places like that, where you had animals coming right into downtown, and people actually saw what the reality was. I think that has changed dramatically. And with the 28-hour law in particular, I think this story kind of tracks some of the social evolution and the dynamics that have changed around this. But after World War II, we had the sort of scientific advancement that allowed for factory farming to be the norm. And just to be clear for anyone who isn't aware of this, like when I say factory farming and when I say animal agriculture, that's the same thing, right? I mean, this is how it's done. So that happened after World War II because there was the ability for, chemistry advancements to allow tens of thousands of animals to be in one place and not have them all die, right? And then, of course, at the same time, you have demographic shifts into more suburbs and cities and fewer farmers. So at that time, you have the USDA interpreting the 28-hour law basically out of existence by saying that it did not believe that a vehicle included a truck. Well, trucks had not been invented in 1906 when the law was last amended, and most livestock were transported at that time on trains. And now it's almost, it's a tiny percentage that's transported on trains. So for a number of decades, there really was no enforcement of the 28-hour law. And then in the early 2000s, we, along with a couple of other animal protection organizations, Humane Society of the United States and a couple others, petitioned. We did an investigation of transport to show just how bad it is. It really is quite, shockingly bad, worse than the 28 hours you would even imagine. And then we argued that, the USDA really can't do that. Like it's what's called arbitrary, capricious, and contrary to law. You're allowed to go against agency action. They're exceeding their authority. And they said, yeah, okay, a truck is a vehicle. About a year later, they came back and said, yeah, a truck is a vehicle. And so they gave that enforcement, we're going to enforce it a little differently. We're going to give it over to the DOJ. And then, here and there, it does seem like they are enforcing it a little bit, but it really is an area that I think this is a law that almost just sort of lives stuck in history. Like it really has not come back, and it should never have gone away in the first place. But, it's an interesting area. There's potential there, but I think more than anything, it's sort of historical, parable a little bit about, our lost way when all this became the norm. The other federal law that applies to farmed animals is the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. So that is, again, only applies to livestock. That one is much more robust, and it does get enforced. It doesn't get enforced nearly as much as I think people would like to think or believe. And in fact, when it does get enforced for particularly severe issues, we may never learn about it. There's a really interesting history about the access to information and all of this, but there are enforcement mechanisms in place. The Food Safety and Inspection Service is supposed to be there watching while they are slaughtering for human consumption, and they are able to enforce it. Now, there's no way for private parties like you or I to go and get the enforcement. We can ask. And sometimes we get somewhere with that and sometimes we don't. But the fact that it does exist and there are regulations, I think is strong. Now, what that leaves us with, though, for most animals and for most of the life cycle is the state level animal cruelty laws. So every state has an animal cruelty law. In most states, they're exclusively criminal laws, which means that in most states, you are not allowed, again, as a private party to enforce those laws. You have to basically persuade the law enforcement, the relevant law enforcement, which could be a humane officer, could be sheriff's department. Then ultimately, it's going to be like your district attorney. The prosecutor has to make a decision to go ahead and prosecute the case. So that becomes a real area of difficulty. A lot of the time, it really doesn't matter. I would say that you could go back and look at all the investigations that we've done, that other groups have done, and try to just blindly just list out how terrible is the footage, right? How strong is the evidence of cruelty? I would bet money that if you then compare that to which ones got cruelty enforcement, there would be no correlation there. That's not the factor that's really driving it. I mean, we never bring a case to, ask for prosecution when we don't think it's really strong argument that they should be prosecuted. But they really do have discretion. It's very broad discretion. The other things about the animal cruelty law, I mean, on one hand, the animal cruelty law, it is really special and unique, A, because it's the only things that apply, right, specifically to how animals are treated, but B, because it really does, as we were talking about, acknowledge the existence of interest for these animals. And they says the law will see these animals, right? There's no other laws that are like, well, you hurt an animal or you killed an animal, and therefore that is a problem, right? This is an acknowledgement of rights in a basic sense, right? I mean, obviously there's debate over, again, what you would count as rights, but there is something qualitatively different about this kind of law than any other kind of law out there. So I think it's a mistake to think that we shouldn't use them or that there isn't potential for them to be used. But one big barrier is, aside from the lack of private right of action, is the fact that in most states there are exemptions for common or normal or normally accepted agricultural practices, that kind of thing. So basically what they're saying is you could do something that could be criminal, and it could be a felony if you did it to a dog or a cat. But if you do it to a farmed animal, what all that the potential defendant has to do is say, oh, well, this is common in my industry. It doesn't have to say it's not cruel. They don't have to say there's something I could be doing differently, right? They just have to say this is something that the industry accepts. So that's sort of a wholesale delegation to the industry in a lot of ways. Now, I would argue that there's a lot of potential there if we could get into court and we could really make arguments about how, you have to think about the reason for an exemption like that, right? You can't just create a complete black box where the court never gets to inquire into whether something's cruel. You have to think that, using the principles of criminal law, using the principles of sort of general justice, right? You can't just categorically give away the ability for a court to examine whether something rises to the level of criminal behavior. So I think if we were able to spend more time, in court on these issues, and oftentimes we get stopped before we ever even get to court, I think we would really be able to provide more of a deterrent to the industry for some of the worst standard practices that are out there. For example, 94% of the dairy industry is disbudding or dehorning calves. That is one of the most horrible things you can possibly witness, right? These animals are writhing and kicking, and they're tying their faces to the side of things. There's one investigation, I think an MFA investigation, where the workers got his fingers in the eyes of the calf because that's stopping him from moving his head. Well, that's done by everybody, but there's no reason for them to be doing it. They could just be using genetically polled cattle, like cattle that doesn't grow horns. Same goes with the castration in the pork industry. Like you can watch these animals, like literally we've had an investigation where they're manually castrated. They're like being ripped out of their bodies. And then the worker will put duct tape around the wound. And then there's body parts coming out as like intestines, and they're pushing them in with their thumbs. Of course, the piglets are like screaming. You're watching this thinking, what is going on? And, you don't have to scratch very far below the surface to find out that there's no reason the industry is doing this. They're all doing it. And there's a separate way to do it that's just using an injection, which has been FDA approved since 2013. No one does it. I think those are the kind of things that could really be major vehicles for change if we can just kind of apply the criminal law to advance the criminal law forward in those areas. And there's one example that really gives me optimism here, which is actually that Tyson case you mentioned at the outset of our conversation. One of the charges within that case was against a common practice, and it resulted in a conviction. And that's the first time that has ever, to our knowledge, that has ever happened, where a criminal, there's criminal enforcement against a standard practice, and it's successful criminal enforcement. So I think that's a real kind of watershed moment where we've made progress around those issues. Now, that was an unusual standard practice. It was a broiler breeder operation where they were using plastic rods to push through the nostrils of the male parent birds. So I talked about breeders at the hatchery level, but those eggs are coming from parent flocks who in the industry are trying to make, they're trying to keep them alive longer because it's more profitable to keep them alive longer. But of course, their offspring are going to be killed at 6 weeks old. So the fact that they're genetically manipulated to grow, very obese, very fast in a 6-week period, and some of them, yes, they're getting heart attacks, they're getting leg deformities, they're, getting their whole bodies burned by ammonia because they're sitting in manure. That doesn't cause such a profit problem for the grow out facility, but it causes a profit problem if that's happening at the breeder level. So they're keeping these birds just perpetually hungry, starving. So they put these, by the way they do it, is they put these rods in their nose so that they can't access the feed for the female birds, which is higher quality feed because they need it to produce eggs. So they're keeping these birds underweight and not satisfied. So it's just sort of cruelty layered upon cruelty. And in that case, we were able to go to Tyson and say, look at our investigation. This is absolutely, absolutely horrible. And Tyson actually stopped doing it. And so did, by the end of the campaign, 17 of the top 20 broiler companies said either we're stopping, and not like phasing it out for 10 years, but just stopping, or we weren't doing it in the first place. So I think that was an unusual situation because it maybe was less entrenched in the industry. And we also had this very sort of lucky situation with the prosecutor who was willing to take that argument and move forward. Now, I will say that's progress, but there is one whole other area where we really have not made any meaningful advancements, and we really need to do it, in which is getting corporate charges, really getting enforceability and accountability around. I don't think that's because the law doesn't allow for it. I think it's because this is the same situation with like sort of prosecution not willing to do that, and there's a lot of scapegoating that goes on in the industry. But I do think there's a lot of potential and a lot of good advancements behind us in the use of the criminal animal cruelty law.
Wow, that's that's a lot to take in and digest. I mean, it's incredible work that you've been doing, and it's awesome to hear a small bit of optimism in amongst all of these, like you say, cruelty laid upon cruelty. I wonder, like, if proving sentience is part of this journey to actually, getting corporations, or at least getting consumers to, to fight against corporations. If we can prove that, unequivocally that, chickens and pigs and, all of these animals have, scientifically been proven to be sentient. Like, I'm thinking of, the law in the UK that's come in recently that's coming in, where lobsters have been proven to be sentient and you can't boil them alive anymore. That's a great step. Are there any other laws that you can see that we're kind of on the cusp of right now, or do you see this role of proving sentience as part of this journey to getting laws passed?
It's a really interesting question. I think to me, just like the cruelty is not the factor, like level of cruelty is not the factor that determines whether we're going to get some sort of accountability, whether it be criminal or civil. I don't think sentience alone as a concept is actually going to advance us. I mean, what I've seen, I'll answer your question kind of two ways. One is sort of what I've seen in terms of the industry reacting to the attempts to get enforcement, or, not just, I didn't really talk about litigation, but litigation is another avenue that we spend a lot of time on. And some of that is to do basically workarounds to the fact that there's no private right of action in the criminal law. So we're trying to find creative ways to basically do criminal cruelty prosecution, but through the civil system. And then there are some litigation that we're doing.
Can you just explain what that means exactly? Because I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah. So for example, so you can take your whole case to a prosecutor and they can say, no, thank you. Like, this is not for me. Just pause for a second and say, the fact that we have that system is a real problem. It's really at the heart of, I think, why these industries are allowed to operate with carte blanche and to do it in a way that gives them confidence that they're kind of in the driver's seat about this. I think, I'll give you an example. So we did an investigation of a broiler facility. We're talking about broilers a lot today, I guess, in about 10 years ago. And one thing that we found there was the practice of dumping birds alive. So they basically would take, again, what they're considered to be unprofitable, whether they're injured, whether they're sick, and they, instead of killing them, there's a whole process in the industry that they're supposed to use to kill them. They put them in this pit outside that has like a little flap on top, and then they would just let them, be buried alive. So among a number of other things, and this is why we always have categories and categories of cruelty, but that particular thing really got to people. It really bothered people, and myself included, right? I mean, I had never seen that before. And we did our usual thing where we really try to push prosecution because it was, particularly horrible. And we actually got hundreds of thousands of petition signatures for people saying, you need to tell, this is Pilgrim's Pride, another huge company that this farm was for. You need to get them to stop. Like you need to go after them for this. And the prosecutors was completely unmoved by that, because of course that prosecutor's job is to serve, their own constituency of this small rural jurisdiction. And that they may, in some cases, I don't know this one particularly, but in some cases they're elected, right? So this idea that they're the gatekeepers for issues that have global implications. I mean, we're talking about massive companies that, there's billions of people, even many more billions of animals that are at issue here. And you're talking about some person thinking about their little corner of the world where maybe this particular company is a major employer. And they're just like, I don't need to listen to this, and they don't. That's just how our system works. So I think that, that's a backdrop. We really need to think about the fact that that's happening as we're thinking about what is the factor that will advance us in law, right? because there's nothing, if you look at the laws themselves, there's nothing that does not acknowledge the sentience, right? I mean, you look at the way that animal cruelty laws are written, and you look at even some of the opinions, which are often very old, that lay out there's real concern for animals in there. It's already acknowledging that. I mean, like, it doesn't exclude birds, it doesn't even exclude fish. We talk about fish as a whole separate topic, right? Although, to my knowledge, the fish cruelty case has never been the basis of a cruelty charge. But I think the point is, the industry really does get to be in control. So what I've seen over time is the industry has gotten very good at PR. They used to do things that would be like, oh, this is not what happened. This is probably staged. These people are just crazy vegan activists, right? They used to do all that. And now they have almost almost verbatim script that they use when these investigations come out that says they are horrified, shocked, and saddened by the cruelty. They have a zero tolerance policy for animal cruelty. Sometimes it says they've fired a worker or workers. Sometimes it says they've retrained them. But basically it's like, we would never do anything, knowingly that would violate our whatever standards. Those standards themselves are a way to be a shield against any kind of legal accountability. They have very little in them. They're very much, meant to look like they're, comprehensive, but in reality, they're basically they're toothless. There's nothing in there that even sometimes doesn't even apply to certain phases in the process. So could they put a word like sentience into let's say the dairy standards or the, chicken industry standards? Yeah. Would it actually advance things from a legal perspective? Unlikely, in my opinion. I think more likely to kind of shake things up would be laws that actually get us into court for animals. So this would be, there's a type of law out there right now called CAPS, Courtroom Animal Advocacy Programs. Currently, the most active one of those, there's only a handful, but the most active one of those is out of Connecticut right now. And that allows people to go in and assist with prosecution, and kind of sort of be a stand-in for the animals. Now, it does not apply to farmed animals as it currently stands, but I think a concept like that could be really helpful to advance law for farmed animals if we could either get in directly and say, we are prosecuting on behalf of the animals, or we are civilly enforcing on behalf of the animals. Or it could be something that, allows there to be sort of the regular process, but then somebody is representing the interests of the animals, which we do for children. For example, we have guardians ad litem. We could do something like that. Now, in terms of what is the role of civil law versus criminal law? So, the examples I'll give about, okay, well, now we can't get anywhere because of, for example, what happened with the prosecutor with the burying alive. There's a number of examples like that. So there are cases where you're allowed to use a completely separate type of law to argue sort of indirectly for cruelty. So, for example, in California, we had an investigation of a hatchery the prosecutor did not want to prosecute, and we used an unfair business practices, like an unfair competition argument, basically saying you can't profit on ongoing animal cruelty. And we argued that we were injured. You had to get into sort of court with an injury basis, standing, because we put the resources into the investigation. And that case, ultimately was successful. It resulted in a settlement. That was the first time that law was used to enforce animal cruelty laws, basically indirectly for farmed animals. So there's a number of examples like that. There are also laws that allow a second sort of hearing, like sort of pseudo private prosecution laws. So there's a case we have right now in Pennsylvania about a dairy industry investigation that we did where the prosecutor did not want to prosecute the case. We used the old private prosecution law to say, you are wrong on your interpretation of the law and the evidence, and we want the judge to basically override the DA's decision not to prosecute the case. So we actually have oral arguments on that, I think October 13th, on an appeal, which is really exciting because we usually don't actually get into a literal courtroom on these issues. So, I think those kinds of things, that would be a great example. That was a case where we had, the hot iron dehorning. That'd be a great example of an opportunity to do that. So I think the answer is there are ways to advance the law. I don't think they have to be as sort of substantively ambitious as, establishing sentience, establishing rights. I think it's in there. There are others, I'm sure, that would really disagree with me. But I think we just need a chance to get in front of people. It would be nice to have, for example, courts that had expertise in animal cruelty prosecution, in farm animal cruelty prosecution in particular, where we could be much more tailored in remedies and, say, this is how we want to fix it. We want to be able to go back and look and see what's going on, for example. We don't want to be scapegoating, individual workers and letting everybody else get off the hook. Not that individual workers, don't do really horrible things sometimes, but it's all part of a system, right? It's all part of a kind of bigger system that continues on with very little damage after these investigations. So we're trying, that's, I think, where the law has potential.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, because the criminal in, probably 100% of your cases and investigations is really, the few corporate entities who control the money and gain the most from continuing to exploit animals and humans and the workers, in this way. So yes, if animal rights aren't, or farmed animal rights aren't even acknowledged, in the law, how would you go about unraveling, such powerful entities as, you've done it, with Tyson, but, how do we go about unraveling these powerful entities where the law is set to protect, the profit? We have ag-gag laws being passed rather than, rights for any kind of farmed animal, or even, like I say, even workers don't seem to have the rights either.
Yeah, well, that's the ultimate question, isn't it? How do you actually go after the sort of main corporate actors? So I'm sure you saw this article that just came out, I think, early September, about how, the top 20 farms are polluting more greenhouse gases than multiple countries in Europe. I think
in The Guardian,
you can see that in the same way for the small number of actors that are responsible for, the massive amounts of animal cruelty. So I think when you're looking at how you address these things, you have to look at how do you target these major corporations that have the ability to make a huge change. For example, when we did that same Pennsylvania investigation, the dairy investigation, that was a Nestle supplier. So we went to Nestle and said, you really should have more vegan options. We also asked them to stop disbudding in their supply chain. They would not do that, but they did add more vegan options. And as the number one food company in the world, that's a huge thing. Like, they have the power and the control over such a huge thing. So even a slight shift like that has massive implications. I think from a legal point of view, you're talking about using a number of strategies. So you've got, the enforcement of the animal cruelty laws, which we talked about. You've got the civil litigation. Now we've talked a little bit about using the civil routes to go directly after animal cruelty, but I think there's a whole world, and it's almost sort of infinitely possible in terms of the list of ways you could do this, of laws that, as I said, are not originally intended to help animals, but could be addressed, could be applied to address these systemic cruelty issues. So, for example, you mentioned the antitrust case, the dairy antitrust case. So what was happening in that case was 70% of the dairy industry, so the dairy industry is, in the US at least, is run by co-ops. So it sounds very quaint, but these turns out to be huge entities with a lot of power. They're also heavily supported by government entities. So what they were doing was they were paying farmers to kill their young productive cows, often their entire herd, often smaller farmers. And they were calling it very euphemistically this dairy herd retirement program. I will say, like, for anybody who's kind of looking for targets, ways to go after the industry, when you see like really Orwellian language like that, where you're like, the best thing they can do is just completely say the opposite of what they mean, that there's usually something there. There's usually something you can do about that. But it is a cow killing program. They killed over 500,000 young cows to take them out of the supply chain to inflate the prices. And their own data that they were publishing on their website was showing that they made over $9.5 billion doing this, at least as of the time that we developed the case idea on this. And then we kind of handed it off to a big class action firm. They spent all this time litigating and pulling all this economic data around. But what the co-ops thought was that they were just protected under this law from the 1930s that says you don't have to be subject to antitrust rules if you're a co-op. Well, that was meant for these tiny, if you're like a regional like sugar grower and you want to get together with your other regional sugar growers so that you can fight the Caribbean sugar like rum companies coming in, right? This is completely turned on its head, right? It was never meant to reduce supply. It was never meant for these big, huge guys. So that case was a really good example of here's somebody, here's an industry really playing a game. They're really playing the rules and nobody's taking them to task for it. And here's an example of where they can do that. Another area might be the use of the False Claims Act, which basically says when you are fraudulently acting in the context of a contract that you have, a sales contract that you have with the federal government, or actually also state governments or State False Claims Act, you can stand in for, as a private citizen, you can stand in for the interest of the government and get that money back. So we were able to do that successfully in an interesting way after a lamb slaughter investigation that we did. And that, those cases almost never take place. And I think there's a lot of potential there. So I think when it comes to going after systemic cruelty, you also can look at things like, the industry really relies on really exploiting workers. There's so many things, that these workers don't have protection. There's a very interesting and very racist history of why there are exemptions for farm workers in a lot of these worker protection statutes. And, trying to kind of undo that, I think would be a big thing. The other big area, I think, here is to try to sort of dismantle the subsidy structure. We are in a situation, and I don't think people understand this necessarily, but at least in the US, there's a strong history of the federal government really pushing animal agriculture kind of over other things, and I'm including feed crops. There's a reason that we farm corn, wheat, and soy over, a number of obviously tons of other types of crops. And that's because most of that is going to feed animals. And that also is very heavily connected in with why do we have so much corn syrup and, Fritos and all of these things that are contributing to other health issues. And it's because of the level of kind of propping up that the federal government is doing. It's a $30 billion subsidy structure that goes to animal ag. And that's completely, you look at, there's actually charts out there, you can look at it. It's just nothing in comparison to what they're doing with like fruits and vegetables, and really like literally nothing. So there's ways maybe to really start dismantling that could have massive implications, and that also includes repurposing some of that money for encouraging more sustainable and animal-free systems.
Wow. Yeah, I'm curious, like, obviously most of your, if not all of your work is about, exposing the reality of what's happening, behind closed doors and making that information public, to, internet users, YouTube, whatever, but also putting it in front of the corporations. And yeah, like you say, they've changed their narrative from, oh, they're just crazy vegans to, oh, we didn't know, honest. But do you believe the saying, if slaughterhouses had glass walls, the world would be vegan?
No. And here's why. There is research on this, and it says basically that information alone is not enough to push that sort of transformative process in people. It's important. You have to have information. And I think, we could spend all day talking about why we don't have access to that information. I think investigations really provide that kind of counterpoint, but it can actually backfire to give just information. And that's because we have a powerful sort of cognitive dissonance mechanism, right? In order to resolve cognitive dissonance, either you change or you change your value, right? Like you can change the value opinion if it's easier than changing your behavior. So people will justify, what they're doing and what they're a part of because they don't want that discomfort. And I think you can look at things like people who work in these places, people who live in these cultures, and there's a certain kind of detachment and blindness. Of course, you'd have to be doing that. It makes total sense. Even something like 4-H, where their job is essentially to acculturate children into this sort of hierarchical thinking against animals and kind of violent and authoritarian way of thinking. But I think what the research says you need, in addition to information, in addition to being able to see what's going on, is a sense of self-efficacy. You need people to feel like they understand the problem and they understand the solution, and they believe that they are able to affect that solution. So if people feel really helpless, or they think that the behavior change that they would have to do in order to resolve the problem would be too hard, the barrier is too high, they won't feel that. They'll kind of feel deflated. They won't feel that sense of confidence. And if they don't feel that, then they go back to kind of resolving the cognitive dissonance in a different way. And another real important component to this, that we've really been thinking about more here at Animal Outlook, is the concept of community, which, you can certainly kind of go on your own, and you can kind of have your own journey into thinking about these things. But in terms of taking a person from really not knowing or thinking about these things all the way through to really internalizing this information and making it, enhancing your identity. I mean, I really think that that's what it's all about. That's where we're trying to go. It's very hard to get there when you feel alone, when you feel like you're sort of going against everyone around you. So feeling like you're part of a community, and I think the opportunity these days to feel like you're part of an online community, is a real opportunity there. But just seeing the things, even if they, cause this whole sort of domino effect of, the industry is going to point fingers, and then people are going to, hope that it's not as bad as what they see, and, but it bothers them and all that, like that alone is not going to get you all the way there. I will say there's, to me, something very weird about fish when it comes to this, because I think you could have glass all over fish places and it wouldn't do anything. It's really interesting because, so we did an investigation of a fish salmon hatchery in 2019, which we're still in litigation over. But it was pretty bad. Like if you just listed out all of the different things that were done, like they were throwing the fish, there was fish eating each other's eyeballs because they were mistaking the pupils for food because they didn't have enough food. I mean, it's just crazy. And then of course, the fact that we let fish just like suffocate and die that way. I mean, if we did that to any other animal, so it really felt like we had to go back to the earlier days of animal advocacy to make these arguments. Like, yes, fish are animals. Yes, they feel pain. The science is there on that, and, the cruelty law, it exists to cover including, everything, including fish. I think there's something, we just have to do as advocates to move us forward on fish. It's a pretty new area in terms of exposure. Certainly, there's investigations from back in the day of open ocean fishing, and people get really upset about dolphins and turtles and sea lions and stuff becoming part of that. But the actual fish, I think people are less engaged, and it's really violent and horrible. So I think we have some more work to do about helping people connect the dots there. But I think for mammals and birds, it's already just viscerally in us. As people, most people are not going to, the vast majority of people are not going to look at an investigation, and say, this is fine. They are bothered by it. It is something that, our problem is not values. It's not cultural values. People do care about animals. They care about them in overwhelming numbers. Even when you ask the questions, should animals have rights? Even when you ask questions like, should farm animals be treated like companion animals? People overwhelmingly do care about them. And that is included in things like, Proposition 12 in California, which is not an animal rights law, but it's a major animal protective law. People come out and vote in major numbers to support laws like that. So the problem is not our values, it's sort of our behavioral norms. and our systems that are in place, like our legal institutions and our political institutions, that really allow for a very distorted, reflection of those values.
And I think with the on the fishing aspect of things, like with the cows and chickens, what people can argue for is like, oh yeah, we want them to be happier, and obviously we care about welfare and we want our line caught salmon, whatever, but at the end, the reality of where the meat and the fish that they're actually consuming comes from is obviously not line caught, or cows living in a field where they live solely off grass. Like where the feed is grown for these animals, like the feed for the farmed fish is taken from out at sea from the high oceans, and it done through trawling. The feed for the cows is from the Amazon or other deforested areas of our planet. So yeah, I do find like connecting the dots is a really important aspect of this, and educating people. But on the point of companion animals, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you today was about companion animals, and it was about how we feed our companion animals, because there's this hidden kind of thing that we don't talk about very often, especially in the animal protection space, where a lot of people have pets, companion animals, and feed them on shop bought meat, right? It's especially if they're cats, you can't bring up a cat on a plant-based diet. Like, what work have you done in the pet food space? Like, is there anything that you can shed light on? Is it like a different environment to, how do we get their food?
Yeah, well, I'll talk about one of our most recent investigations, and then I'll kind of, you can do a zoom out and talk about pet food in general. But I think, so this was our first investigation that specifically targeted a place for pet food. But basically, this is a New Jersey slaughterhouse that slaughters both cows for what they call like high performance dog food, and also horses for exotic animal feed. So what's really interesting, just sort of an interesting wrinkle, just to note that I think most people in the US do not think there is horse slaughter in the US, and there isn't for human consumption, but because animal feed is such a weird area in terms of its regulations, that it doesn't apply there. So, non-human consumption horse slaughter is happening in the US. So that's kind of interesting. What we did in this case was we got a sample. The first thing we did was we got a sample of the dog food and we tested it, and then tested positive for pathogens, salmonella and that kind of thing. And that caused the FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration, to issue a recall, which ended up being most of the products, the dog food products or major products. And then we went in there, with our hidden camera, and documented a spent dairy cow. So these are animals that, are no longer profitable within the dairy industry, and they're sent to slaughter. In this case, the animal was dragged by a chain out of the trailer, and then they used what's called a captive bolt pistol, which is like the best way I can describe this to people is like, it's like from No Country for Old Men. If you've seen that movie, that's what the villain in the movie carries around. It's in a big slaughterhouse, it would be attached to like a hydraulic system, but there's also the handheld version, which essentially is a gun that shoots out a bolt, but then it captures the end of the bolt, so it doesn't actually stay in the animal's head. And you have to be pretty skilled. I mean, there's diagrams and stuff. This is the kind of thing I spend my time on. There's diagrams and stuff you can look at to see exactly where you have to, shoot a cow in the head. It's very difficult to find the right spot. So it's a pretty skilled thing to be the person who's called like the knocker, the person who actually shoots the cow. So in this case, they end up shooting the cow multiple times, several times, and over the course of many, many minutes. So under the Federal Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, you were supposed to knock them once, and then that's it. It's effective. They're unconscious. They don't wake up. There are cases where the Federal Humane Methods of Slaughter Act has been enforced against multiple knocks. So a few seconds in between is bad. Like, you really shouldn't be doing that. If the worst case scenario, you mess it up the first time, you should be doing another one immediately, because it's really bad for them to, still be conscious and suffering through it. In this case, it was many, many minutes in between multiple knocks. and there was the dragging, and it was also really dirty and disgusting. So we argued that that is a violation of federal and state law, and there's a number of agencies that are involved. So we're still working on that. We're looking into some other, sort of similar places too. But, the whole reason that this area, like we're getting a lot of bouncing between one agency saying it's not them and, going to another agency. And I think that is indicative of one of the big issues with pet food is that the USDA interprets the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, where it's FSIS, which is the inspection people that would do human consumption, to not apply to them. I mean, we argue that at least the humane treatment side of what's in the HMSA should be and does apply to the pet food slaughter. Or the non-human consumption slaughter, but it's FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, that has the major enforcement authority here. So there's no like inspectors in the slaughterhouses for this kind of slaughter. And okay, so now I'll kind of zoom out a little bit and say this. Yes, pet food is a really big source of meat consumption. The statistic I see here is dogs and cats in the US eat as much food as all of the people in France, and contribute to 25 to 30% of the environmental impact of meat consumption. That's from Science Daily. But I think what's important to understand is we're talking about a lot of this being condemned meat. So this is meat that is coming from animals that are so there's a system called 4D. It stands for dead, dying, diseased, or disabled. And so those animals cannot be slaughtered for human consumption, although they play fast and loose sometimes with what's considered a downer because they can get them back up and then put them back in the food supply. And there's a whole bunch of litigation around this and laws and fight around this with the pork industry. But when it comes to these animals that are arriving at slaughterhouses or they go down at a slaughterhouse, those are the animals that are most likely to be already suffering and then treated horribly once they are in that boat. So we saw, for example, at Central Valley Meat, which is a spent dairy cow facility slaughterhouse in Northern California. So what we would see is animals either, they're in bad shape on the truck. They might be able to get them up off the truck. They go down in what's called the yards before they are put through like the chute to get into the slaughterhouse to be slaughtered for human consumption. And then, there's an effort made to, they shock them, they use their tail to push them up. There's all sorts of ways that they try to get them up. If they can't get them up, they are using the captive bolt pistol. And in that case, we also had multiple knocks over multiple minutes, a long period of time. And then in that case also, which was completely bizarre, after the multiple knocks, over a course of minutes, the workers would sometimes be standing on the nostrils of the cows to make sure that they were suffocating to death, which actually we did get enforcement on humane slaughter law on that case, but not for any of those kinds of issues. So anyway, once they're dead, they are then injected with a dye. I think it was like a blue dye. There's like a syringe, and then a little bobcat tractor comes along, drags them off to the rendering area, and then that's going to go to something like pet food. So it's important, I think, to if you're taking away nothing else from this conversation about pet food, to really recognize the relationship between some of the worst treatment of animals and the pet food industry. And I don't think that I don't think the pet food industry itself is propping up necessarily the animal ag industry, but certainly it's allowing for an incentive structure that does not say you have to treat these animals well, or does not say, if this animal is just going to be subject to horrible misery and dragged around and, poked and prodded and their tail broken to try to get them up, that, you should maybe do something different about it. Like certainly the pet food industry, the fact that they can sell that over to rendering, I think is, we really should be examining the incentive structure that's there. But it is a byproduct of some of the worst treated animals and the worst treated industries, the egg industry, the spent egg laying hens and the dairy industry.
But you're also saying that in the US, 20 to 30% of the animals they're diseased or dying, right? That essentially in the main kind of meat industry, that's that's like,
I don't know if we can say that. I think it says they're saying 25 to 30% of environmental impact. So I think the environmental impact is disparate along mammals. I mean, of course, birds have a huge environmental impact too. I think the question, how many animals versus how much poundage are we looking at? I just don't know. I don't know if we have statistics on anything like that. But I would say, I mean, my strong guess would be that it's heavily dairy and eggs industry byproducts that we're looking at in pet food. And I'll just say, this is not to, of course, I'm an animal lover. I have a dog. I've always had dogs. And, there is such a thing as vegan dog food. Like, we don't have to make this really complicated. You can just go to the store and get vegan dog food. So it's not like, we have to sort of sit here and do a lot of hand wringing around, is this ethically acceptable, and what should we do to sort of change all these things? But, it's just sort of, it's a choice that we have, just like it's a choice that we as people have to be vegan, I think.
Yeah. And, I don't know where I am on the fence with like cell-based meat and things like that. And particularly like as a, more of a whole food leaning vegan, I'm not going to eat it, or, I'm not going to eat cultivated meats and things like that. But for the pet food industry to be replaced, for cats, if we could get, a meat that is, has the right nutrition levels that can feed, animals that can't live off a plant-based diet, like a cat or whatever, then that would be an amazing win, I reckon, on our side.
I think that this may be, I don't know the update. It's been years since I've heard this, but there was some cell cultured meat company that was making mouse cat treats, mouse meat.
I saw something about that recently, actually. Yeah, that's right. There is.
Yeah, so that's kind of fascinating, thinking about what applications there might be for things like that.
Yeah,
they feed their cats vegan diets, just fortified with taurine and all that. I mean, that's a whole nother topic. But I think it's just one of those things where it's kind of like, yes, you can wade into that conversation. Yes, there are these choices. So it's just something to kind of consider as part of otherwise a very hidden industry. I mean, the FDA also delegates its authority to a private entity for nutrition. It's this AAFCO, I think is the acronym of it, but it's a totally private entity. So we don't know what's going on there. FDA is not there with the actual slaughter. USDA is not there. It's such an oddly hidden thing. And I think at least, as advocates, as people who care about animals, as people who care about, the other negative impacts of factory farming, I think we have to look at these are the worst of the worst that are then being dragged off and literally, dragged to a corner, and then they show up again as kibble,
I mean, I have so many million questions for you. I could just keep talking to you all day. But I think I should probably let you get back to your day job, as it were. But I had two more things that I'm burning to ask you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So one topic, I mean, obviously this week we're focusing on animals in society as part of our theme week. And one topic that we know throughout the last couple of years, and particularly I think through COVID, when everyone's kind of locked and at home, and the uptake of TikTok and things like that, is the use of animals in GIFs and on social media platforms. So creating these funny videos, and actually some videos for selfies, the stories of these rare dolphins who the calf has been passed around, different tourists taking a photo with this little dolphin and the dolphin dies, and all of these kind of things in the name of kind of social media, and creating influencers. You get paid X amount of dollars per view. It's an incredibly difficult thing to track and trace, and to find the people who actually created the footage, etc. And yeah, just day after day you see more and more of these stories coming out. I was wondering if you know of any law or any research or work or investigations that are being done in that particular space in terms of figuring out who created, whichever GIF, or which influencers get, etc. Is there anything that you know of that's going on in that space?
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a very famous US Supreme Court case about this. And it's not it's not about anything nearly as sort of innocent or clueless as what you're describing, right? I mean, I think you can make the argument that, this is just sort of what you're describing is just sort of, thoughtlessness kind of getting out of hand, right? And I think that would be a much milder version and a much more kind of acceptable or excusable version than what I'm about to tell you, which is about the history of trying to criminalize crush videos. Is this something you're familiar with?
Yes, I've never watched one.
That's good. Yeah, so I mean, in a basic sense, these are fetish videos that are meant to basically they're commercial vehicles, right? I mean, people are trying to make money on these videos, and it's often things like a woman in a high-heeled shoe slowly crushing like a rodent or even a larger animal. I want to say I've heard that there's like kittens in some of these videos, but I think most of them are smaller animals, like rodent-sized animals.
I've definitely heard of kittens as well.
What?
I've definitely heard of kittens.
Yeah.
Too, yeah.
It's one of those things that I know I like heard in that context, and then I wanted to just be like, I'm just going to pretend I didn't hear that. So there was a law that was meant to criminalize these videos or knowing, distribution or depiction of these videos for profit. And there was a First Amendment free speech constitutional argument made against them in litigation around this, and it went up to the Supreme Court of the United States. Ultimately, the Supreme Court found that it was unconstitutional. It was too broad. It was not clear that, the way that the law would be applied would not apply to constitutionally protected speech. And, it's very different. It makes a lot of sense if you kind of look at First Amendment law, although I think it's very interesting if anyone is sort of so inclined to pull up the opinion and some of the briefing on the case, including an amicus from HSUS, to get into kind of the distinction about, is this about a restriction of speech or is it about preventing a practice? And I think a lot of the law around First Amendment is that debate, essentially. Like, yes, something is speech, but is it more a practice than speech? And this is why we have obscenity laws around things like child pornography and stuff. Like, it's not about the speech, it's about the crime that's taking place. So there's a lot of interesting debate about that. But what I think was actually most interesting about that case is that the discussion among the court around what is cruel is basically, we don't know. There could be something in one state that's cruel, and in another state it's not considered cruel. There's no way to say up front what is, actually considered, something that could be fall under this. So then you could imagine realistically applications of the law that would cover protected speech. So they, give an example, like, I think their example was something like, there's certain kinds of hunting or hunting at all. Like, hunting is not allowed in the District of Columbia, but it may be allowed in, Virginia, which is right next door, or certain types of practices. So basically what they're saying is, we have this very inconsistent and sort of irrational relationship with animals as a society, and our law kind of reflects that, right? We don't know exactly, what kind of stance we want to take about a given practice here or there. And there's, it's all kind of a mismatch of different states' laws around different things and different people's opinions around different things. So, this level of confusion that we have really makes trying to regulate, something that's obviously quite bad, that obviously is animal cruelty across the board, really kind of a quagmire. You can't totally create kind of a black and white law on quicksand, right? We need to become, I think the lesson for us to take out of this is we need to become less confused as a society about what we consider to be problematic to animals. So basically, I think the answer to your question is there's really not practically, that I can see practically anything to be done about this in terms of, legislating about it. But I think certainly it should be part of the conversation in terms of creating a clearer ethic that's reflected in the way that actually is a reflection of values, right? I think the law as it currently stands, especially for farm animals, is terrible in terms of its, of its actual application. But I think that's because it's controlled by a few powerful people who want to be able to continue exploiting animals. I don't think we should look at that and see it as a reflection of societal values. At the same time, I think we have work to do making sure that those societal values are reflected in the law. Otherwise, our hands are tied in situations like this.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So all of that kind of horribleness aside, what's the dream investigation for you? Like, what would the vision be? What would you love to do that you just haven't been able to do yet?
Well, I think, for every investigation, we need resources, we need sort of skill, but we also need a lot of luck, right? Like it's funny because, these places don't want us in there. It's not like we can just sort of have our pick of wherever we're going to go. I think there's two areas that to me really make a lot of sense to continue to focus on and to try to build on. One is, as I mentioned, those few actors that control everything, right? That control the lion's share of things. And in order to be in a position where we can maximize our potential impact of an investigation, I think keeping the sort of through line as direct as possible between the investigation and one of these big players is really important to do, or has a lot of potential. Not to say that we don't investigate these smaller places, and I think small, large, we've seen a lot of issues with every level. But I think really being able to get into some of those places and saying, no, you can't walk away, and you can't just say, oh, this is a supplier, I didn't know what they were doing, can put us in a position where we could do a lot with that. I also think there's a lot of areas in animal agriculture that we don't know anything about. I cannot tell you, I literally woke up in the middle of the night recently, just suddenly occurred to me that I have no idea what happens to the pigs that are used in breeding in the pork industry after gestation crates and farrowing crates. We've never seen that. We've never seen, are they depopulated? Do they go to slaughter? Are they killed in some way individually? I don't know, and there's other things like that we really have never seen, a breaker facility in the egg industry. That's even worse than a regular battery cage facility. We know that from little bits and pieces, but we've never seen an investigation of it. And I think there's other things. We've seen one ever investigation of a veal slaughterhouse, for example. Animal Equality just did a really interesting investigation where they caught the fetuses of spent dairy cows going to a slaughterhouse, and what happens to the fetuses and how they're kind of delivered and killed. And that's horrifying. And we kind of knew that existed, but I'd never seen it in an investigation before. There's those sorts of things. I think there is a systematic kind of hiding that's going on, and we've really in some ways only scratched the surface. I mean, in some ways we know exactly what we're going to see when we walk into one of these places, and in some ways we don't. There's always something new, there's always something different. So I think when it comes to investigations, our job first and foremost is to be accurate and complete reporters of what is going on, and to give people that window into these places, and to really give them the chance to sort of see for themselves what's happening. And then our sort of second responsibility is to be as thorough as possible, as complete as there corners of this world that we have not seen. And then, of course, the more we can use that as a vehicle to advance cultural change and create corporate accountability, I think that's kind of the sweet spot of where we want to be. And
it would be, I'm sure my team would be very angry with me if I didn't ask, what do you do from a self-care perspective? Because the content and the investigations and everything that you have to witness and think about and talk about, and you're waking up in the middle of the night thinking about it, is there anything that you do that helps you be able to kind of manage this kind of onslaught of stuff that you have to witness?
Yeah, what's interesting, I don't know if this is self-care, but I've gotten to the point with investigation footage where it doesn't, if I feel like I can do something with it, it doesn't traumatize me. I understand that it traumatizes other people, and it really certainly it has a huge impact on the investigators. But there's something that, to me, there's something so powerful and so frankly positive about the potential from investigations, that, you know, that sense of kind of transformative potential that I really feel like when we get something strong, I feel that sort of like burst of energy to, we can do something with this. I want to get this in front of people. I want to make sure people understand. I want to do right by the investigator. I want to make sure that investigator is, you know, really, you know, that their efforts and their sort of, you know, all of the trauma that they go through really is kind of, and of course, what they're trying to do is be a voice for those animals. You know, they have to sit there and stand by while those animals are being mistreated. So I'll tell you, for me, and I think I've heard this for other people who spend a lot of time with investigation footage or who have actually been into these places. Most people do not go through this process. It is available to anyone who wants to do it, but I totally understand why most people don't do it. If you sit with investigation footage long enough, if you get past the trauma, past the blood and the violence and the intensity and the kind of flinching, you know, your brain does this sort of interesting thing where you get into this like detachment and this kind of, there's a certain clarity around the fact that what we're doing here is so wrong, it's so off. And I'll tell you like what happened with me. That was actually the Central Valley meat investigation, the one I was talking about with the blue dye and the standing on the nostrils of the cows. I can't tell you how many, I probably spent one day, we're really trying to get it out to the enforcement. So I probably spent 14 hours in one day watching footage, which was mostly slaughter line footage of that investigation. And then I went outside and I was driving around and I saw some people playing kickball in the park. And I live in Southern California. It's super sunny. It's like beautiful. There's palm trees and it's, you know, and it just occurred to me like, okay, well, some people spend their days playing kickball in the park. Some people spend their days like blasting the brains out of cows with a captive bolt pistol, right? I mean, the fact that we do that, you know, and again, like you make that face because you should, it's like you're a feeling human being. But at that point, because I'd seen the footage for so long, I had this like this sort of calm detachment from it and thought to myself, like, if anyone could come and observe this, that this is what we do as a species to our fellow species on the planet, they would think we were just the most absolute bizarre. Like we go around teaching our children, you know, and telling each other to be kind to each other, to be respectful of autonomy and rights, you know, to not mistreat people or treat people differently based on the way that they look or, you know, that where they come from or any of these things, right? Like we have all these values that we really hold dear. We have a sense of justice. We have a sense of order and accountability and all this stuff, right? And then we have this going on, you know, which is completely a gaping wound in that whole way of looking at things. Like we can't have a society where meat eating is normative and we can continue forward with these institutions and these values that we purport to hold. And I remember just thinking like, you know, why are we doing this? Like, why do we as humans do this to other animals? Like, it's so wrong, and especially cows. Cows have this very trusting sort of body language. They're very gentle. They're very sweet. In fact, I think that's why they're exploited to the degree that they are. And then, you know, it really left me with this question of like, who do we think we are? You know, and first it was like that outrage, like, who do we think we are? Like, why do we think it's okay to go ahead and do that? But really, like, who do we think we are in like a bigger sense, right? Like, who do we think we as humans are in terms of our relationships with, you know, this world that we're living on, these other animals? And it just sort of kind of all came together for me in that moment of kind of like, you know, seeing all these people in the park and the sunshine and then just all this like over and over again, all this violence and killing. You know, it's like, yeah, we can't be doing this. Like, we can't be continuing to kill animals. As much as you hear justification and as much as you hear people avoiding the topic and stuff, like the reality is that it's violent and it's, you know, really against the way that, you know, that we want to build a society and that we want to live as people. And I just, yeah, I think that in itself is the thing that kind of keeps me attached and going and using these investigations to the best way that we can.
I mean, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Like, and I can see that from the work that you do and the, the unstoppable nature of what you've all been doing at Animal Outlook, just making sure that these investigations get into the right, places, whether it's the general public or, whether it's the corporations or the suppliers, the people who are selling the products, etc. Incredible. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been really insightful. I've learned a lot. And yeah, I hope everybody listening has as well. And I'm sure people are going to want to know how to find you and find the work that you're doing. Like, where should they head to?
Well, thank you so much. I'm a huge fan of Sentient, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come on here. I think what we're doing is really, really wonderful. We are at animaloutlook.org. You can do what I just described of going through a bunch of investigation footage there if you want. You can also sign up for our e-newsletter and keep apprised of what we're doing there. You can become a monthly donor, which is a really crucial role you can play. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and please subscribe to our YouTube, which is where some of our best content is as well.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Have a good day. Hopefully either watching footage and feeling good about it, or maybe go and kick a ball for a minute.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.